And here is where we finally get to talk about digital forensics. Now, forensics is of course a useful topic, but it can also be fun as well. And by definition, forensics is about discovering and collecting evidence, digital evidence, that could be accepted in a court of law. Now, digital evidence, of course, is going to require a set of computer-based tools to discover, to collect, to preserve, that is, to properly store that information, since you cannot see, touch, or put digital data inside of a plastic bag. And as a science, I would say, in itself, forensics can be useful for a number of scenarios, starting with explaining or trying to discover how a security incident managed to happen, what was the root cause of that incident, or confirming if any crime or compliance violation or anything else unacceptable has happened during that incident. It's also helpful for collecting incriminatory evidence in case a crime has occurred, so somebody has to be blamed or even, punished or fined or jailed. Also for finding out if sensitive data was exposed when a breach happened or when an attack happened. It can also help us determine if sensitive data was stolen or destroyed. It can also help us with compliance checking, that is, obtaining proof that a company was legally compliant before a breach occurred. It's very useful for insurance purposes or for legal exposure, being able to prove that, we've taken all the necessary precautions and it still happened, right? Because, it happens. But at least we can prove that we performed the due diligence tasks required to prepare, to be as prepared as possible for such an incident. Now, handling forensics properly means following the right procedures, so that there is no room for interpretation, and this is very important whenever you go inside this legal realm. Now, such a procedure might have some of the following phases, starting with identification. So that's going to be about securing the environment, securing the crime scene if a crime happened, making sure that the scene is safe. If someone's life is in danger, try dealing with that before thinking about forensics. And this is also where we try to identify the scope, that is, what exactly are we going to look for, what type of digital evidence we're looking for. Then comes the collection phase. This is where you make sure you have the necessary authorizations to collect information and that you use the right tools that will make that collected evidence admissible in court. Analysis then is about making the actual copies of everything that you gather for analysis, of course. Also, this is where you have to be sure that you can prove that the copies that you're making can be related to the original, and you have to use specific toolkits or specific software or hardware combinations to analyze the collected data. For disk images, we're going to have to hash those images in order to prove that the contents haven't been changed since they were captured. And we always have to make digital copies of the data. So we're never going to work on originals. We're never going to dig for information on the only storage device that we have, like a hard drive, for example. We're going to collect information from memory dumps as well in here. We're going to see a couple more places where we can collect information later on. And this is where we start thinking about chain of custody, because it's required for evidence to be admissible in court. Chain of custody means who handled the evidence, how did it pass from one owner to the next, how it was handled, how it was stored, so that there is no moment between the collection of that evidence and the moment when the evidence is presented in a court of law, when that evidence could have been altered or modified or tampered with. And as you probably know from, movies and cop shows, this is where we're going to use things like evidence bags or tamper-proof seals, right? And don't forget to update that chain of custody list every single time the evidence changes ownership. And finally, of course, the last step is going to be about reporting. What methods did we use? What tools did we use? And of course, what did we find? Our findings and our conclusions. Now, when it comes to forensics, data collected in a forensic investigation might be subject to something called a legal hold. A legal hold means that whatever information might be relevant to a court case or in some litigations has to be properly preserved. Now, this can affect digital information that cannot be further modified or destroyed, or even physical evidence like servers or hard drives that might be retained as evidence, and you still have to comply even if that means I don't know, maybe downtime perhaps for your business. Make sure that whenever you're involved in an incident, you appoint someone with strong legal knowledge to be the contact for your forensics team or incident response team, so that you know exactly which instructions you must follow from a legal standpoint. Now, in most cases where a security incident has occurred, most of the time it's going to have something to do with a specific endpoint that was compromised, a host, a workstation, or even a server. So data acquisition is a process, very important process, for obtaining a forensically clean copy of that device's data. Now, in the digital world, this is not so simple because some data might be lost when a computer is powered off. Other data might only be obtainable if the computer is powered off. So the order in which data has to be collected from an endpoint is done in the order of so-called volatility, which basically says collect the data that's more likely to be lost first, right? And then handle everything else. And this order of volatility basically says that you should capture first things like CPU registers and CPU caches. Then you're going to look at the memory, perhaps generate a dump of the contents of the memory. This is where you'll be looking for routing information, ARP tables, process lists, process table, kernel statistics, and so on. The Windows registry also can be accessed from the memory, even though most of the Windows registry is also stored on a disk, but certain sections are memory only, so it's best to analyze it from a memory dump. Of course, we're going to look inside persistent mass storage devices such as hard drives, SSDs, flash memory, flash card, USB sticks, and so on. You should also collect even the free space. Collect the information stored in the free space, because file recovery procedures can reveal deleted files within that disk space. Then we have to look for any kind of remote logging and monitoring solutions. Now, if you're just capturing information from somebody's computer at home, you're probably not going to have a logging and monitoring solution installed there, but inside of a company, you might find one. The physical configuration of the host, of the network topology, of course, also has to be collected. And finally, we're going to look for archival media, things that don't go anywhere, don't become obsolete, are not volatile. Things like optical media, tapes, backup, hard drives, any kind of data that can be stored in a drawer, for example. Some of the well-known digital forensic tools out there that you can use to collect this type of evidence. Just to mention a few, EnCase Forensic. This one is a case management product, also for various other types of investigations, and includes some components for digital evidence management, also called e-discovery sometimes, as well as for analyzing networks and endpoints. Another one is FTK, also known as Forensics Toolkit, or the Sleuth Kit from Kali. It used to be embedded with Kali. Depending on when you're watching this video, it might or might not be embedded with Kali, but nevertheless, it's an open source collection of tools for creating disk images and analyzing files. Now, you also have a GUI for this, which is called Autopsy, and it's also available for Windows. Well, apart from the digital tools out there, you will need one or more computers dedicated for forensics investigations. Now, they're going to need to be under very strict control. They're going to be hardened and completely isolated, ideally, from any devices involved in the security incident. Sometimes they're even going to be isolated from any kind of network whatsoever. Now, these workstations usually have some above average specs. You're not going to play any games on them, but they're going to have a lot of processing power, a lot of storage space, to store the disk and memory images, and a wide variety of connectors for pretty much any type of data storage device, as weird as they can be, that you might find out there when you're collecting data. Oftentimes, these workstations come equipped with something called a write blocker. The write blocker is a small hardware device that it is mounted between the computer and a remote storage device that you want to access, like a hard drive or a USB drive. What it's going to do is going to disable any write operations, maybe accidental write operations, making that drive that you're mounting read-only. So we're basically not allowing our operating system to write anything to that device Because if we did, then we would be tampering with that device and it wouldn't be admissible anymore. So that's the definition of a write blocker. The memory, the random access memory in a computer, will be your most valuable source of information. So capturing the memory contents could be critical to an investigation. Now, not only it's going to store valid data, applications, programs that are running, but it's also going to store some sensitive data like cryptographic keys or passwords. Also, most data, even if it's encrypted on the disk, you might be able to find it in an unencrypted format inside of the memory, because in order to use that information, whatever piece of software uses that encrypted information, it first has to decrypt it, right? So inside of the memory, inside of the computer's RAM, you have a much better chance of finding that content in an unencrypted form, at least as long as that information is being used by some process. Now, among the methods that we can use to extract memory contents, we have a number of them, starting with live acquisition. This one requires a special tool that simply copies the contents of the memory as the system is running. Now, as you probably know, the contents of the memory are constantly changing. So unfortunately, such a tool must run with kernel privileges for a proper capture. So it has to be installed and it has to be running where? In memory, of course, and you might not want to tamper with the memory before capturing it. So running such a tool with user privileges would only get you some partial results. And let me just give you a couple of tools to choose from when it comes to memory acquisition, starting with Memorize from FireEye, moving on with Tactical from Fresponse, or Magnet RAM Capture. Now, some of these are free as well. Next method is capturing a crash dump. Memory dump files are created by the operating system when a critical kernel error or a kernel panic or a blue screen of death occurs, if you wish. You might not want to cause such a crash intentionally because you're going to lose a lot of data, but you're still likely to find previously created dumps from previous errors. It's still memory contents. It's still going to be unencrypted, even if it's waiting for you on the disk. If hibernation is enabled, don't forget about the hibernate file, another type of memory content file that is simply waiting on the disk for the taking. Now, this file is used to save the contents of the memory, so it's basically a memory dump, right? When the computer is put to hibernation. Just like sleep, except it doesn't consume any more power. That's why we save the contents of the memory, because if we cut the power to the memory, it's going to lose its data, right? So we save it on the disk, and then we load it from the disk to return to the computer to the exact previous state it was in when it was shut down. The page file, don't forget about this one as well, because it's also an extension of the memory and it's also stored on the hard drive. It's an extension of memory because this is where the programs start paging information from the main memory when the main memory doesn't allow any more data to be stored in it. Of course, you're not going to find the entire memory contents in here, it's just an extension, but it still might reveal useful information when you search this page file for some useful strings, for example. And well, of course, after you capture this memory, you have to analyze it somehow because it's going to be in raw format, right? Binary random data in there. So you need some smart tools to analyze that memory content. One of these tools is the volatility tool, the volatility framework, if you wish. It's free. You can even run it as a Docker container. That's the name here on the screen if you want to pull it from my own repo. Just running volatility here with a -age parameter is going to run a Docker container, and in a couple of seconds is going to show us all the supported parameters that we can use to analyze a memory dump. Look how many options we have here regarding processes, memory locations, types of files that might be loaded inside the memory, specific strings like domain names or file names that are being loaded inside of the memory, command line arguments, and so on, right? So we do have a lot of flexibility here with this tool, and so let's try playing with it with just a couple of commands to see how it works. Now what I have here is a memory dump. You can find it online. It's very widely used in trainings for demonstration purposes. It's kind of old. You're going to see what kind of operating system is inside of it. And it was basically captured a while ago, but it's okay, right? For training purposes, it's more than okay. And it's not even that big. It's just a couple of hundreds of megabytes. So this is the memory capture that we'll be working with inside of volatility. All right, so let's run this command. Again, I'm going to run a container based on this image right here. And I'm also going to mount inside of the container the location of my memory dump. And inside of the container, it's going to be located somewhere inside of the /dumps directory. Now, as part of the command itself, the last argument here is going to be the command that I'm actually sending to the volatility framework to be executed. In this case, I'm going to point it to this specific file with the -f parameter, right? And then I'm going to ask for some information about the image that I'm providing, right? So let's press enter and give it a couple of seconds to analyze the memory dump. And we can already see some information coming in. The profile of the image, as you can see, it should be based on something like Windows XP Service Pack 2 or Service Pack 3. So I told you this was an old image, right? What else do we have here? Physical address extension is enabled. It was captured from a computer with 1 CPU. All right, and this is a timestamp. This is when the image was captured, right? Not much information so far. Let's see if we can get something more interesting here. So let's repeat the command and this time ask for, how about the list of processes currently running when this image was captured? That's a PS list parameter. So let's press enter here. Give it a couple of seconds. And there you have it. That's the list of processes inside of the memory that were running when, when the image was captured. Notice the Windows services, the applications that were running at the moment, and even their process IDs and the handlers, and a lot of information that you can normally get from the task manager. Let's look for some other type of information here, like for example the active connections, right? Networking connections that were active when this image was captured. All right, we only have one, but it's still very useful here. We can see local address and local port that was used to connect, and the remote address. So who was this host right here from which the memory was captured talking to, right? On port 8080. And even gives us the process ID of the process that handled this remote connection, this active connection. Another one is connection scan. And even though I'm repeating myself here, one word of advice: live memory acquisition is difficult to implement in real life because it's going to rely on running some sort of a tool on that specific machine. And this kind of tampering in most cases makes the captured data impossible to prove that it's genuine and it's not modified. Now, disk image acquisition is a bit easier than live memory acquisition since it can be safely done while preserving the original consistency of the hard drive or the SSD being acquired. Disk imaging is usually done bit by bit, thus copying all the drive sectors, including the free space, and copying just the files is not recommended because you might miss some hidden files or some deleted files. You can also look for alternate data streams and deleted but recoverable files. Now, alternate data streams can be used to hide information in an NTFS file system, for example. Hide a file within another one. And we can do it in a number of ways, of course, starting with live acquisition, again, while the computer is running. The downside is it's going to take a lot longer than with memory, so the contents might change during the imaging process because it takes so long. Or we can perform it statically by shutting down the computer first. There's a small risk that an unexpected shutdown might trigger some anti-forensics data destruction processes, right? Doesn't just happen in the movies. Or we can perform it statically simply by pulling the plug on that computer. Again, this is going to be against some malware detecting the shutdown of the host, but of course you're going to risk corrupting some data. Write blockers, we mentioned this already. It's a tool that prevents any data from the device being copied from being contaminated or changed while the copy process is running. And effectively, it's going to block any write operations, any system calls that include write operations that might come from your machine and might attempt to change the contents of the device being analyzed. Now, this can be a hardware device in most cases, or it can be a software component within the forensic workstation, like a driver. You're going to need some imaging utilities, of course, and different tools are going to provide different output formats for the extracted disk images that they generate. Some use proprietary formats with additional metadata, some use raw file formats like the results generated by the DD utility in Linux. This is one way of using this utility. It's basically performing a bit-by-bit copy from an input device to an output device, right? If you do have a computer with a hard drive connected to it, you can basically perform a perfect mirror of that drive onto another one or onto a disk image. A special mention here about imaging tools. Some forensic tools out there can also directly import the virtual disks files created by the virtualization software. So like VMDK files in VMware, or VHD or VHDX files for Hyper-V, or VDI, if I'm not mistaken, files for VirtualBox. Because for virtual machines, their disks are already image files, right? So you just have to grab those, that's it. You don't have to capture anything. Remember that what we're doing when it comes to forensics must be admissible in court. So for any disk image that we extract, we need to be able to prove that it's identical to the original and it has not been tampered with. How do we do this? Well, the standard for ensuring integrity of any piece of digital data is to use a hashing algorithm. That's going to generate a cryptographic hash, also called a fingerprint or a digest of that original data. Now, any changes to the copied data and the hashes will not match the original, right? So making that copy unusable in court. Some common hashing algorithms, even though I don't think I have to reiterate this, are going to be like SHA-1, SHA-2, MD5. SHA-1 used a 160-bit digest with some weaknesses. It was now replaced by SHA-2 with digests with up to 512 bits. MD5 is still found in most tools as it is faster and provides some better compatibility between tools, but it's not considered so secure anymore. And it also uses a 128-bit hash. Now, most image acquisition tools are going to automatically calculate this hash and store it for you, but in case you need to verify a hash or calculate your own, there are some tools that can help you out. On Windows, you get the search util tool, which if we add a help switch at the end is going to give us the supported parameters here. If we scroll up here, we should be able to find the hash file parameter, generate and display cryptographic hash over a file. So let's use this one, hash file, and ask for more information here. And it's going to ask us to provide a file and a hashing algorithm. And the supported algorithms, you can find them right here at the bottom. So let's try this with the image that we were just looking at. So search util, hash file, Cridex vmem, and let's calculate a SHA-256 output. Give it a few seconds here. And there you have it. This right here is the resulting hash. Now on Linux, you do have similar utilities here. For example, MD5 sum or SHA-256, SHA-1, SHA-2, SHA-384, 512, and so on. So pick whichever you want to use. You have separate utilities for each hashing algorithm. File carving is worth mentioning. It's a method for extracting data from a disk or a disk image, whereas there is no explicit file information available. Basically, it's similar to some file recovery tools that attempt to reconstruct the deleted files, accidentally deleted files on a hard drive. Now, this is made possible by the way in which file systems on hard drives or SSDs store data. The smallest unit on a disk is called a sector and can range from 512 bytes to around 4096 bytes. But only the hard disk or the SSD knows about the sectors. It's a low-level function of the hardware. The file system itself cannot reference each sector individually, but can address groups of sectors called blocks or clusters. Now in NTFS, the default block size is 4K. You might have seen this if you try to format a drive or a partition, or 496 bytes basically. So you might recognize this window. You can see for NTFS, the default allocation size is 4K, right? It's already selected here. So when a file is created on a disk, it is actually created in a new block across one or more sectors. Now, if the file is large enough, it will take up more than one block, but if the file is much smaller than a block, it will still reserve the same fixed block size on the disk. So if we were to look inside the properties of a really small file, it only has 1K, you can see that even though the size of the file is just 1020 bytes in here, the size on a disk is still going to be 4K, right? It's because that's the size of a block, and you cannot allocate less than a block for a file. So the file system actually needs to keep track of which files belong to which blocks in a table, and that table is called the master file table in NTFS. Now, what happens when you delete a file? Deleting means that the operating system simply removes the reference information from this table. The corresponding blocks and the sectors are not deleted on the disk, they're simply marked as free in that table. Ever notice that deleting a 10 gigabyte file happens instantaneously, but writing it takes some time? So even overwriting a file doesn't mean the same blocks are used. So deleted file contents or even replaced file contents can actually remain on the disk indefinitely, and that is what file carving tools do. They look for useful content in those unallocated blocks and try to piece that information together in an attempt to rebuild those deleted files. One last important topic here is the chain of custody. It's about keeping track of how evidence was handled and by whom, from its acquisition to its presentation in a court of law. Now, the purpose of a chain of custody is to prove that the integrity of the evidence has been preserved, that it hasn't been altered, changed, destroyed in any way since its collection. And it's documented in a chain of custody form, a document that clearly describes who has released and who has received the evidence. So every time the evidence changes hands, so to say, it does have to show up in that chain of custody form. And it's really simple. It's basically a form that looks like this. The item, the quantity, description, and the chain of custody here says that this item at this timestamp was released by, received by, and any comments regarding the transfer of information or how it was stored. And that's basically it. That's a sample chain of custody form from NIST. So it's an official document. And chain of custody is very important, not just because evidence needs to be preserved, but sometimes it needs to be preserved for years until the criminal case or the security audit or whatever concludes. So over time, computer hardware can fail. Storage media can become unreadable even if it hasn't been used. And this is a concept much older than digital forensics. A similar process is carried out to preserve things like fingerprints on object or biologic material from a crime scene or traces of gunpowder and so on, except that tamper-proof bags nowadays might require anti-static shielding to protect electronic components against electrostatic discharge. And a couple more topics here covered by forensics, starting with the network. Now, in the network, you first have to capture traffic from a host or a network segment. So on a host, that's probably going to be by using some sort of a packet capture tool, or if it's a network traffic, then you're going to rely on something like port mirroring, span, or a tap device. The sniffing is usually done behind the firewall. For mobile devices, we're going to encounter some difficulties recovering data from them because they pretty much all of them have device locks or they are encrypted by default nowadays. But don't forget to look inside cloud backups as well, because that's where the good stuff might be. A Faraday cage can be used when collecting information, which is going to protect that mobile device from any kind of wireless communication with the outside, including remote wipe commands that might be sent by the person who is being investigated. Call data might be useful as well, and this type of call information can sometimes be subpoenaed from the carrier itself. Don't forget about the geolocation history. Sometimes this is also backed up in some cloud, which is going to show you when that device was at a certain location in the past. Investigating virtualized environments can be easier than pure physical environments simply because hypervisors can already read the memory inside the VMs that they are managing. And also, when it comes to the disks that you're supposed to be collecting the information stored on the disk, as we said before, data is already in an image format because virtual machines store their disks inside of an image file in some shared storage. Now, the problem here is that sometimes this type of storage is going to be highly fragmented due to thin allocation of virtual machines. And thin allocation basically means allocating the storage space as you need it, as you require it, not everything from the very beginning. If you need another gigabyte, you're gonna extend that storage space on the disk and so on, which creates a lot of fragmentation because you don't have a pre-allocated space that looks like a solid block of storage where all your files are going to be stored. They're going to be all over the place. So it's just going to be another step to take into account when performing file carving operations, for example, reconstructing those file fragments from the disk. Alright, so that's it about digital forensics. I know that most people don't expect a chapter like this in the CySA Plus trainings and exam, but you might have one or two questions regarding things like chain of custody, preserving evidence, or the order in which data should be captured from a workstation, right? So try to remember those at least. In any case, thank you so much for watching. If you found this useful, like and subscribe, and see you next time when we're going to be talking about technical controls for securing data. Thank you and good luck.